Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the next edition of our guest speaker series here at the Holland Land Office Museum. This has been a about 7-year-long program we've been doing, where we have at least one speaker a month, sometimes a couple. So I want to thank you all for coming. This event series is sponsored in part through a grant through GoArt from the New York State DEC program, so we want to thank them for helping us out to bring in speakers like Derrick from many counties away. But tonight our speaker is Derrick Pratt from the Erie Canal Museum, all the way in Syracuse. So he's made the trek down the thruway to us today. He's going to talk about baseball in the 19th century along the Erie Canal. So we're very excited. This is the third time we've had Derrick here. He's done a different topic every time related to canal. It's always very interesting, so I'm sure this one will be just as interesting.
Oh, now I got pressure, but I'll try to make it interesting. All right, thanks everyone for coming out. Real quick, just curious how many people have been to the museum in Syracuse? All right. Throughway. It is not the throughway. Okay. There are friends, yeah, we're right in downtown Syracuse. If you're in the area, you should stop by. So the #1 thing to do on TripAdvisor. We're also open 7 days a week, and we're free. So, but anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about the history of baseball during the towpath era of the canal. We'll start our story here. So the Erie Canal, constructed 1817 to 1825, along with several branch canals, like the Shenango Canal. I know we have a Shenango Canal fan over here, plus Genesee Valley Canal, and the one pictured here, which is the Oswego Canal. Creatively, it went to Oswego. This is an image of Fulton, New York, probably late 40s, 1840s, I should say, or sometime the 1850s. When this was being digitized, I believe it was for just a talk on the Oswego Canal someone was making, but it was noticed something happening here in the foreground. If we zoom in, you can see some folks in this early image of this canal town playing a game, which we've mostly identified as the game of town ball. This is kind of an early antecedent of baseball. So it would have been a lot different than the game of baseball that we know today, other than it had a bat. You can see the guy there with the bat, and a ball, but town ball, as the name kind of implies, it had different rules. That rarely happens. It had different rules depending on what town you were in, regarding how many runs needed to be scored to win, how many innings there were, how many people played on a team, etc., how outs were got. Town ball's kind of a chaotic thing, and it also depends on how big your town is, etc., how your rules are going to be organized. But this is a cool documentation of that time. We also have other evidence that as soon as the Erie Canal and other canals opened up, baseball was being played, or early versions of baseball were being played along its banks. For instance, it's documented that shortly after the Erie Canal opened in Syracuse in 1820, on the north side of the canal, one of the earliest things this growing community created was a ball field. Then you can also judge the popularity of baseball because in 1842, the city banned the playing of ball in most public spaces because it was a bit of a nuisance by that point. So you can see it's becoming so popular, you had to make it illegal. Today's talk, though, is going to focus mainly on professional baseball in the canal corridor, so the area around the canal. But keep in mind that throughout kind of this whole story, every town in and along the canal has its own baseball team, a lot of times several different teams playing amateur ball. the rules of what we now know as baseball first get codified kind of in New York City, technically in New Jersey, by the New York Knickerbocker Club. They create the Knickerbocker rules. This is the New York version of baseball. Nowadays, baseball has its own, we all know the rules of baseball all across the world. But this is an early era. Different cities, notably Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, all developed their own style of baseball that had slightly different rules. We're going to primarily focus on the New York style because, based on how the canal worked, trade with New York was connected with up here. So we're playing the New York game. Pro baseball sort of gets its start, or at least one of the first major leagues, is founded January 3rd, 1857, with the National Association of Baseball Players. A year later, they will charge the first ever admission for a game. So this is when money first enters the game of baseball, when the All-Stars of Manhattan play the All-Stars of Brooklyn. Right at the end of the canal corridor. Of course, once money starts entering in on the ownership side, players start saying, we want a piece of that action too, right? Which leads us to this man. This is Jim Creighton, often considered one of the first pro baseball players, also sometimes credited with inventing the fastball. This is how early baseball is. Someone still has to invent a fastball.
As far as you can, yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So the NABBP had strict amateurism rules, so you weren't supposed to get paid specifically, but they found a lot of ways around this. Much like today, a company softball team might bring in a ringer. Similarly, you've got that here. Guys get do-nothing jobs. A lot of fire departments actually have baseball teams. Jim Creighton plays for the Brooklyn Mutuals, getting paid by a fire department primarily to throw a baseball for them, less so to put out house fires. So Jim Creighton's one of the early guys, along with another man, Dickie Pierce, who is credited with inventing the shortstop position. They'll also get paid in another way, one of these charged games. It's a benefit game, but it's not in the way we would have a benefit game, right? If you go to a benefit baseball game now, it's generally benefiting some sort of charity. Back then, you benefited the players. Pierce and Creighton were the two best players at the time, so they got...
Can I just ask you about that photo? Is that head implanted on another image there? Or is that...
That I don't really know. This is
look down below, it doesn't look real.
It doesn't look great, but I don't know. This is one of the few images of Jim Creighton, because shortly after this, he dies during a baseball game. There's some debate over what killed him, possibly the way he pitched. Others said he hit a home run hard enough that it snapped something inside of him. Either way, he died from internal injuries a few days after a game. He will not be the first death, but he's inaugurated paying players. During the Civil War, of course, New York contributes the most soldiers of any state to the cause. So a lot of those guys, when they're not fighting, when they have downtime, they're going to play baseball to relieve stress, while away the hours. And baseball spreads all around the country through these New York soldiers. Since there's so many New Yorkers, the New York game predominates. There's even one Civil War battle in Texas that begins when a Union outfielder is shot. That's when they know the Confederates have arrived, right? After the war, though, the NABBP expands rapidly, almost out of control. There aren't really strict rules on how you can become an NABBP team. You've got, Batavia could theoretically field an NABBP team, but the Brooklyn or Manhattan team is going to steamroll them. But they're still in the same league, because those Manhattan teams and stuff can pay players like Jim Creighton, etc. again, we see this thing. You can tell something's an issue when you have to make it illegal. 1866, the NEBUP makes paying players illegal. It's still largely ignored. If you do openly pay players, you will get banned from the league, which is important to note.
Can I ask a question as to why? What's the logic of that? Rationale banning paying players?
Amateurism. It's very interesting. If you look at old newspapers, it looks exactly the same as modern newspapers a lot of time, where they say money's ruining the game, and like these players don't want to play for the love of the sport; they want to make money off of it now. Something you can see in the pages of SI today, and most of the big teams are still ignoring this prohibition on paying players anyway. Two of them are the Cincinnati Red Stockings and the Washington Nationals. Neither have an entirely paid team, but they have several paid players. End of the season, 1868, the Cincinnati Red Stockings lose to the Washington Nationals. This causes them, we're going to get to the canal soon too. The Red Stockings and Nationals, this is kind of like a championship for the NEBUP, if you will. And they're tired of losing. They want to win the next year. So in 1869, the Red Stockings will unveil a totally professional team. They will openly say, we're going to pay all of our players, we're going to be the best team in baseball. We don't care if the NEBUP bans us, you're still going to pay to buy a ticket to come see the Cincinnati Red Stockings, because we'll be that good. They open up the season in Cincinnati for a few months. They go undefeated. Then they start heading east. They head on the road. And their first trip sends them down the Erie Canal corridor. They will make their first road games in the canal towns of Buffalo, Rochester, Troy, and Albany. In Troy, at the eastern end of the Erie Canal, they face a tough opponent. A rivalry starts to begin brewing with Troy's team, the Troy Haymakers. But during that East Coast trip, Cincinnati Red Stockings go undefeated yet again, head on back to Cincinnati. And a few more of these teams head west, go to Cincinnati, including on August 26th, when the Troy Haymakers arrive in Cincinnati. They're a rough and tumble team, as you can kind of tell from the name, right? The Haymakers. Seems to have been a fitting name for them. They also apparently had some connections with organized crime, gamblers, and the like. There were a lot of rumors swirling around this game. This is also an era when, this is before like the Black Sox scandal, when like harsh repercussions will be made for gambling on games. So there's also rumors swirling around the Red Stockings as well, that they might be involved with gambling. But anyway, Troy Haymakers, August 26th, they play in Cincinnati. The accounts we have say that in Troy, people were gathered around the local telegraph office, listening, well, not listening, but however the play-by-play via telegraph worked. They were getting that. Late in the game, a controversial play occurred at the catcher, so much so that the manager went out and essentially filibustered. This is an era before electricity, and he yelled at the ump until the sun went down. And then you got a tie baseball game. The Cincinnati Red Stockings will go on to win every other game they had that year. They are enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame for beginning professional baseball and for their undefeated season. Their sole blemish on their record came at the hands of a Canal Corridor team, and they would not lose a game until June 14th, 1870, when they would play the Brooklyn Atlantics, playing what's kind of believed to be the first extra innings game, which they lost 8-7. So somebody should have, gotten out and argued when they were tied until the sun went down.
Okay,
Yes.
so, yeah.
Were any of these players Civil War veterans?
That's a good question. I would think probably, but I can't tell you definitively.
Tough guys.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, back then, tough.
For sure. I don't know if any of the Red Stockings were. Seems likely a Troy Haymaker to Providence, but yes.
You said something about connections to Canal at this point, but did you not?
Yes.
Brooklyn?
Well, Brooklyn is obviously not connected to the canal. These cities are all on the canal. However, the whole purpose of having the Erie Canal is to
Right.
access via the Hudson,
New York City.
New York City. Yes. So New York is closely connected with the whole canal corridor. But Red Stockings lose to the Brooklyn Atlantics. And as Meadowlark Lemon said, no one likes a loser. And people stopped showing up to Cincinnati Red Stockings games, and they will move to Boston, where they still exist today. Anyone know who they are?
Come on, Boston Red Sox.
No.
Oh,
Boston Braves.
Yes, there we go. Yes. The Boston Red Stockings will eventually turn into the Boston Braves, then the Milwaukee Braves, now the Atlanta Braves. Yes, 3 teams in Major League Baseball are actually named after the Red Stockings. Also the Cincinnati Reds and the later American League Red Sox will take their name from this team as well. So, interesting little fact. After the Red Stockings win with this fully professional team, fans clearly don't really care about amateurism. They want to see good baseball. The NABBP falls apart. In 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players is formed, or the NA. This has a few teams. Periodically in the Canal Corridor, one of the founding members is the descendants of the Troy Haymakers, the Troy Unions. But this isn't a great league. It's poorly run, and it falls apart in 1875. So a new league needs to be established. It's important for us to remember that the 2 major leagues we know today, the National League and the American League, no one knows they're going to become Major League Baseball, right? They're just a league that has good players in it. However, 1876, you will get the first of those 2 leagues founded, the National League of Baseball Clubs. The next year, this is another important professional baseball league that will form, especially here in upstate New York, around the Canal Corridor. That is the International Association, later the International League. That is still with us today. The Buffalo Bison, Rochester Red Wings, Syracuse Mets all still play in the International League to this day. However, at this time, it's much closer to the National League than that is today. They're not feeder systems. This is also a professional league, largely recruiting local talent, but you don't have that enormous of a skill gap that you have today. The National League will, of course, be a bit more stable than on many of the previous leagues that we've talked about. See how it still exists today. However, it's not fully stable. A lot of teams go in and out of the National League. But finally, in 1882, you have your first season ever in the National League where no new teams are added and no teams leave, creating the first ever circuit. So let's look at those real quick. This is a map also of 1850 with all of the major canals. And you'll see that canal ports largely dominate the National League. And you'll see why the name of this talk is the center of it all. So we got the Chicago White Stockings, the Detroit Wolverines, the Grove City or Cleveland Unions, I believe it is, the Buffalo Bison, the Troy Trojans, the Worcester Redlegs, Boston Red Stockings, and the Providence Grays. So you can see right there in the middle of this National League is the Erie Canal. This is an era when we're right kind of in the center of all of this action. And a lot of the game's stars are coming from this corridor as well. And we're going to look at those folks for the rest of this talk. And at those teams. First, we'll look at the team we've already talked a little about, the Troy Trojans. So, the Trojans are themselves descended from the Haymakers. They joined the National League in just 3 years after it was formed in 1879. They would feature on their rosters during their stint in the major leagues 5 future Hall of Famers. Dan Brothers, Mickey Welch, Roger Connor, Tim Keefe, and Buck Ewing, each of whom is very interesting in their own right. We're going to talk a lot more about Brothers in a bit. Welch is one of the first 300 game winners, as is Tim Keefe. He's really interesting. He begins his career throwing underhand from 50 feet away. He will end his career the first year that he starts his career, the last year that you throw from 50 feet. He will end his career the first year that they throw overhand from 60 feet 6 inches, where it is today. So he himself is an interesting guy. Roger Connor is who he will be the all-time home run king before Babe Ruth breaks his record. And Buck Ewing is often regarded as the greatest catcher of the 19th century. So pretty stacked roster here, right? Well, unfortunately, these are all young guys. The Trojans are terrible. They will finish last or second to last in the National League every single year that they play. In fact, 1882, that year that we highlighted, they will be respectfully told by the National League towards the end of the year not to come back. In fact, at their park in Watervliet, West Troy, just off of the western or the eastern terminus of the canal. At one point in September of that year, 6 fans will attend a Troy Trojans game once they know the team's not coming back. So that's the Trojans. They'll kind of fade away into obscurity after this point. But if we look at Dan Brothers here, he's an interesting connection with the other one of those teams we highlighted in the Canal Corridor, the Buffalo Bison, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But let's look at Dan Brothers, because he spends much of his life in the Canal Corridor and connected with a lot of what we're going to talk about. So Big Dan, as he was called. I always find it amusing because he was about the same size as me. I'm tall, but I'm not like Mark McGuire or anything, right? But he was born May 8th, 1858 in Sylvan Lake, New York. He gets his start with the Wappingers Falls Actives when he is a teenager. It is there he gains the attention of local Major League scouts. When, in a play at the plate, he kills the catcher when he runs over him. That'll get your name in the papers. And he is signed in the Troy Trojans' first National League season to play at the eastern end of the canal in Troy. However, the Trojans will make a crucial mistake with Dan Brothers. They have him pitch. Dan Brothers is very much not in the Hall of Fame due to his ERA. He is pretty bad at pitching, and he'll get cut. He'll go on to Rochester, where he plays there in the International League for a few years, before he is signed by the Buffalo Bison. And he will play with 7 different teams over the next decade and become one of the most feared batters in the league. When he retires, he is in the top 5 in every major statistical batting category. He's a great baseball player and is really wanted by a lot of people. We'll look a bit more at his Buffalo career in a second. But he loved baseball. He would play professionally until he was 46 years old, when he was still playing in his local Hudson River League. And his story is actually not done there. He'll be back later to talk as well. But let's look at the team he is probably most famous for playing on. The team at the western end of the Erie Canal, the Buffalo Bison. So, organized baseball can be dated as far back as 1859 in the Queen City. And professional baseball starts in 1877 when the Buffalo Bison joined the International Association, which we've talked about a bit. They would join the National League the same year as the Trojans in 1879, and they were a good team. They included people like future Hall of Famer Pud Galvin, the first left-hander to win 300 games. But they really become one of the premier teams when they establish the Big Four. And that's Dan Brothers is kind of the core of it. But you also have Hardy Richardson, Deacon White, and Jack Rowe will all play for the Big Four. They're stars. The Bison never win the pennant, unfortunately for them, but they will finish in second and third place every other year. So you've got the two kind of polar opposites of the National League at the two different ends of the canal. The Trojans always in the basement, and the Bison always towards the top. However, they were unfortunately, this doesn't happen anymore because it's been realized that this is a good way to destroy fan base. The owner of the Detroit Wolverines was also the owner of the Buffalo Bison. And he thought, you know what I can make more money with if I had one really good team in Detroit than two fairly good teams in Detroit and Buffalo. So he shipped all of the Big Four for pretty much, like a bag of socks to Detroit. And the Buffalo Bison were not long for this world after that, at least not long for the National League. They will fold in 1886 when after they get sold out, the fans stop coming to the park. See the Florida Marlins for similar.
Can I ask you a question as we go on a timeline here?
Yeah.
You mind? Okay. Do you know how Abner Doubleday is associated with, creation of baseball?
Great question. Abner Doubleday.
By the way, I'm wearing a shirt.
I noticed.
Yeah, where it's depicting his, 76th regiment? Yep.
Yes.
New York regiment, and they're depicting playing something like baseball at their camp.
Yeah. Doubleday. This is tangentially related here because the guy who came up with that myth has already been in the story as a pitcher for the Red Stockings and also as a founder of the National League, a man by the name of A.G. Spalding. You've probably heard of his sporting goods company. Still exists today, right? They had gone on a tour of American Baseball All-Stars around this time period where they were toasted in England for having taken the game of cricket and rounders, these English sports, and made them American. Spalding was very mad about that. It was like, baseball is an American sport, sends out a call saying, prove that baseball was invented in America in the 1880s, 1890s, I believe it was. Eventually, the silver miner in Nevada writes in, says he remembers in 1848, Abner Doubleday creating the rules in Cooperstown, New York. Since then, this claim has been debunked like 8 different ways. Doubleday wasn't in Cooperstown at the time. The guy who wrote the letter was like 3, so probably couldn't really remember it well. Doubleday was at West Point, so you have to sign out to leave West Point, which he never did that year that he was supposedly invented. But Doubleday's a Civil War hero. Doubleday's a fascinating character in his own right. Like, he's kind of a hero at the Battle of Gettysburg, and he's involved in the Battle of Fort Sumter as well. He is credited with inventing the streetcar in San Francisco. He's the president of the American Theosophical Society. So yeah, it kind of sticks, and it's never escaped. But that's about as far as I can get into it.
Okay, that's enough.
Yep. Yeah. So, Detroit's going to leave the National League, return to the International Association, where it will primarily exist for a while. However, in 1890, another Major League is formed in the Players League, which will invite the Buffalo Bison to play. So you've got the Buffalo Bison in the major leagues, albeit briefly, in 1890. This is really one of the last times a major league team will play in the Canal Corridor. That won't be the last. And of course, the Bison still continue to exist to this day, playing Salem Field, just about 2 or 3 blocks off of Canal Side in Buffalo now. So if you ever go to a Buffalo Bison game, be sure to head on down, and you can see the full-size replica of DeWitt Clinton's first canal boat, which was put in the water last week. So that's a pretty cool thing. And now I want to look at another guy who played for the Buffalo Bison, and his life also largely revolved around the Canal Corridor. That is this man, Joe Hornan. Born in 1857, he was born at the northern terminus of the Black River Canal in Carthage, New York. However, his family shortly after that appears to have moved to Utica. Hornan also, I should note, parents, I believe, were German immigrants, based on what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And Utica has a pretty major German ethnic community as well. In 1875, he begins his baseball career with the Utica Amateur Baseball Club, and quickly earns the attention of some International Association scouts, signing at first with the Tecumsehs of London, Ontario in the International Association. There's a Canadian team in this league, hence the name. The IA has teams at various times in almost every canal city, including many of the side canal towns. There's an Oswego International Association team at one point, a Binghamton one, as well as Utica, Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, Albany, Troy, etc. So even sometimes relatively small towns are part of this association. After playing with the IA, though, he gains the attention of the team on the other side of the border in the National League, the Buffalo Bison, who will sign him for 2 years to play there as a left fielder. However, he is shortly after traded to the Boston Red Stockings, where he spends most of his career. And there he became one of the game's most prominent outfielders. He is an incredible left fielder. He gains the nickname Ubbo Ubbo because that is what he would yell to call other players off of the ball. And interestingly, his scrapbook of his life is preserved in the Baseball Hall of Fame, even though he himself is not a Hall of Famer. And I was lucky enough 8 years ago to get to go through his scrapbook, which really gave an interesting look into his life, and you could really see the life of a guy who lived, even though he played in Boston. This is an era back when you still had to work, during the off season, and you go back home, and his home was always in Utica, from what you can tell. He is a pretty prominent member of the Utica community. His off-season job is an electrician, so he probably one of the first electricians in the Canal City of Utica. And he was also heavily involved in the German community of Utica as well. He was the director of the German language choir and was involved in most major German clubs in Utica as well. And that's an interesting part of the scrapbook. A lot of it's in German. So you can see kind of the influences of immigration on the Canal Corridor at this time. Another interesting tidbit about his scrapbook, I was going through it, he saved like every single box score of every game he played in. Which, when you're going through those pages, it gets pretty boring after like 3 pages. It's like, I get it. But he had written in the margins on one of them, he said, Galvin, good game. And I was like, oh, I know that name. That's Pud Galvin, Hall of Famer for the Buffalo Bison. The good game that happened was the first ever no-hitter thrown by a left-handed pitcher in National League history. So he was not an overstated man, that's for sure. But You know who was? One of his teammates, another guy from the Canal Corridor, who played with him on the Boston Red Stockings, Michael King Kelly, born of Irish immigrants in the canal town of Troy. You can see Troy seemingly had this incredibly rich baseball history.
Hey, say something about Troy, since most of my life was in the Capital District.
Sure.
It might surprise a lot of people, because, but 1850s and on, probably through 1900 or so, Troy had the 4th highest per capita income in the United States. All the ironwork and such.
Yeah. Well,
So that's some money if that mattered, I don't know.
Oh yeah, it definitely does. Troy is a happening city during this time period. It's really more the eastern terminus of the canal than Albany was, because there was kind of a shortcut to the Hudson River down in Troy.
Wow.
King Kelly's parents, however, certainly did not have amongst the 4th highest incomes in America. They're destitute for much of his childhood. They actually moved shortly after this to New Jersey, and he plays for a number of teams in the National Association and International Association before signing first with the Chicago White Stockings before moving on to the Boston Beaneaters. And he is this incredible innovator and one of the first superstars of the game. He's most famous for his innovations in base running, specifically how you slide into a base. In fact, he has a great impact on the pop culture of America at the time, because right as he's innovating his famous Kelly slide, so too, you're starting to get phonographs. They've just been invented as well. And you have your first hit record in American history is the song Slide Kelly Slide, which is about him. He is this flamboyant star known for his hard drinking and his womanizing, which he often runs into some issues with his with A.G. Spalding, who's the owner of the White Stockings, and his manager, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, Cap Anson. There's a famous story at one point that he's banned from drinking alcohol during the season, and they hire a private investigator to follow him around, confront him. But the investigator says he's been drinking lemonade in a saloon at midnight, to which Kelly supposedly replied, "That's nonsense. It's pure whiskey. I would never be caught dead drinking lemonade at that hour." He's quite the guy. He's not like Joe Horning and many of these other people. While he does, even though he's a huge star, he still has to earn money in the off season to live. However, he doesn't do it by becoming an electrician or doing any other sort of job. Really, he becomes a vaudeville star. So he would have traveled probably throughout the Canal Corridor, performing his most noted routine. He's the guy who would make the poem Casey at the Bat famous. He would pretty much play himself doing it. Also, that Players League that we talked about, Buffalo joining, he's a big reason why that exists. He's not getting paid enough in the National League. He forms kind of a rebel league that will pay players better and treat them better. So that's how you get the Buffalo Bison in that major league as well. Also, because National League games aren't paying all the bills, the teams of the era would kind of barnstorm on their way to different National League clubs. So it's not like today. The Detroit Tigers go to play the New York Yankees. They're not going to stop in Syracuse, right? They're taking a direct flight there for one, but also they're not going to play like the Syracuse Mets. They're better than them. They know that. However, back in the day, when you need to make some extra money, you play local clubs. And we see that in July 17th, 1885, when the Chicago White Stockings of King Kelly and this man, Cap Anson, will play in Syracuse. This is the White Stockings are the team that keep the Buffalo Bison from winning the pennant during their great years with the Big Four. The Syracuse Stars will beat the White Stockings on this day. And this is a huge moment for Syracuse itself. History books about the city of Syracuse, 50 years after this game is played, will include the time the Stars beat the White Stockings in their accounts of the history of Syracuse itself. So let's look a bit more at that team, the Syracuse Stars. Syracuse, much like Buffalo, gets its start with organized baseball in the late 1850s. 1858, the Syracuse Stars are founded in 1875. This is Syracuse's first pro baseball club. They're nothing really notable until they sign a guy by the name of Henry McCormick. He is a local bricklayer who also pitches. They would go up to play in a tournament up in Watertown, where they get absolutely killed by a pitcher named Candy Cummings. Candy Cummings, also, I should note, was educated at the seminary in the town we saw at the beginning of this talk, Fulton, New York. I learned about this when I gave this talk in Fulton, because they said to me, "Oh, you know, Fulton's where the curveball was invented." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Candy Cummings pitched for the local seminary team when he was a boy, probably perfecting what he is usually credited with inventing, the curveball." So.
Did you say it killed somebody, actually? Or?
No. These guys are metaphorically killed
Alright.
by the curveball. They just get struck out a lot. But Candy Cummings shows up the Stars and Henry McCormick with this curveball. But McCormick is intrigued. He wants to know how Cummings throws this pitch, learns how to throw a curveball, and after that, McCormick becomes one of the premier pitchers in the league. And the Syracuse Stars rise in prominence. They are huge. And on the back, or the arm, I guess, of McCormick, they will be invited in 1879 to join the National League. However, their time there is short. They are, competing with the Trojans for who's going to be last place in the National League. They're quickly drummed out. However, they will continue to be really good in the International Association, later the International League, including in 1888 when they win the International League title, with the team pictured here. And they have a fascinating roster. I forgot, they will also join another one of these competitive major leagues in 1890, the American Association. So, 1890, big year for Major League Baseball in the Canal Corridor. They'll also play at Lakeside Park on the shores of Onondaga Lake, which is connected to the canal system. And interestingly, fans to go see the Stars could get a ticket on a canal packet boat that would take them directly to the stadium. We have written evidence of that boat existing. But let's look a little more at that 1888 International League team pictured here. It includes some really interesting folks. You've got lowlights, if you will, like Bad Bill Egan, who, as the name implies, not a nice guy. He is also noted as the man with the most plate appearances where no one ever bothered to say what hand he batted with. That's his big claim to fame. And Dick Higham, who is noted as the only umpire to be banned for life from baseball for gambling on it. That'll be later in his life. But they're both on this 88 team. But then you've also got two great pitchers. Ed Dundon, who is interesting because he was, in addition to a great pitcher, deaf and mute. This is an era that was really big for deaf individuals to excel at baseball. A lot of schools for the deaf really wanted to show the world that deaf people were exceptional, just as good as anyone else. So a lot of attention was paid on their baseball teams. So you have a lot of deaf baseball players during this era who are incredible. Dundon is sometimes considered a guy who may have helped create the current signs for pitches. These deaf pitchers, to know which pitch the catcher wanted them to throw, they would get a signal, essentially sign language to them. The other guy, not pictured here, who was great for the 88 Stars, is Bob Higgins. Bob Higgins is notable because at this point he is one of the few black pitchers in the International League, one of the few left in professional baseball at this time. And he is not the only black player on the Stars. The other we should look at is this man, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who is incredibly important in the history of baseball itself in general. So let's look a little more at the man pictured here, Moses Fleetwood Walker. Born same time as most of the other people we've been talking about, 1856. He will go to college in Oberlin and then the University of Michigan, playing baseball for both of them. In 1883, he was signed by the Toledo Blue Stockings to be a catcher. The next year, the Blue Stockings were brought up to the American Association, another one of these major league, what was then a major league at the time. When they move up to a major league, Moses Fleetwood Walker is considered largely to be the first black player in the history of Major League Baseball. It's pretty notable. However, that year they would also play the guy we saw earlier, Cap Anson and the White Stockings. Anson, a huge star, refused to take the field against a black man, and also convinced ownership and other players that black players should be banned from the National League. Shortly after that, a gentleman's agreement, as it was called, was reached, banning black baseball players from the National League, which would not be broken for another 70 or so years when Jackie Robinson took the field of the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. However, the International League was not segregated at that time, so Walker moves over there. In 1888, he joined the Stars as a catcher. He and Bob Higgins would form in these integrated leagues, the first ever all-black battery of catcher and pitcher, and Walker's veteran presence is often credited with helping them win that 88 title. However, he was released by the Stars shortly thereafter. However, he continued to live in Syracuse for a number of years, getting a job in the post office and even helping to secure a patent with a Syracuse University professor. However, the next year, 1890, would be not a great year in Fleetwood Walker's life, because while he was walking through the canal community of Syracuse, he was accosted, apparently while passing a tavern by some Irish immigrants who began calling him racial slurs, etc. Eventually one would attack him, and in the end, he stabbed him to death. Not Fleetwood Walker stabbed the man who attacked him. Resulting would be a second-degree murder trial. He would ultimately be acquitted of that, but it was major national news at the time, this incident in this canal town that brought a lot of racial relations at the time to the forefront, and about whether or not it was self-defense or not. Walker would then leave the canal corridor, going on to form with his brother a black nationalist newspaper espousing back to Africa ideals of Marcus Garvey before passing away in the early 1900s. But an interesting character, an important one in American history, right here in the canal corridor. Another important figure in the early history of black baseball is from the canal corridor as well, a man who just got enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame 2 years ago, Bud Fowler. Born in Frankfort, New York, on the canal. He actually spent most of his life in Cooperstown, and he too was eventually banned from the National League. He would start barnstorming teams. He also played, I believe, for the Binghamton International League team as well, before the International League also closed its doors to black players. But he started a very successful all black barnstorming team, which eventually morphed into the Negro Leagues, which would keep black baseball alive for until 1947. Right? So this leads us to the last major figure we're going to look at, John McGraw. He's born about a generation after all the other players we've been looking at in Truxton, New York, just outside of Cortland. McGraw began his career with the Truxton Grays, eventually ended up at the southern terminus of the Genesee Valley Canal in Olean. He's a guy, he starts out, much like Dan Brothers, pitching. Not a great pitcher, but he could throw a curveball, and that impressed a guy on a train who signed him to become a professional baseball player. This is back in the day when you could just impress a guy on a train and get a professional baseball contract. But anywho, McGraw plays in Olean and Wellsville before he becomes particularly famous with the Baltimore Orioles. This is not the Orioles of today. This is an Orioles in the National League. He becomes a star along with fellow Oriole Pee Wee Reese. They help innovate the hit and run. Additionally, they have a lot of cool tricks. The famous Baltimore chop. They still have some players chop still. They apparently had a great relationship with the groundskeeper in Baltimore, who would pack the dirt really tight. So when you chop the ball onto the ground, it would bounce incredibly high, so you could get to first base before it even came down. Similarly, they would not cut the outfield grass too short, so you could strategically hide baseballs in the outfield. McGraw is kind of famous for pioneering a lot of these innovative techniques. Also at third base, he was famous for grabbing guys on third base's belts, holding them there. There's a famous anecdote that one time a player, knowing he did that, unbuckled his belt, and McGraw was left standing at third base holding a belt in his hand, right? They become an incredibly successful team. They will also bring on an important veteran presence, winning several National League titles when they bring on at first base Dan Brothers again. McGraw becomes quick friends with this man who is 20 years almost his elder, but learns a lot of the game from Big Dan. And he will eventually bring his talents for kind of coming up with innovative baseball playing to the New York Giants, where he will become their longtime manager and becomes the winningest manager in National League history. Also, while he's with the Giants, he'll hire his good buddy Dan Brothers after he retires at age 46 from the Hudson River League to become the groundskeeper and gatekeeper at the Polo Grounds. And McGraw is often credited with really bringing about the innovations that transform the game from the 19th century into the modern baseball game we know today. And let's talk a little about the birth of the modern era. In 1901, the American League is founded. Am I doing time-wise? Okay, I got a couple minutes. Perfect. American League is founded. In 1903, you have your first ever World Series. The American League's Boston Americans beat the Pittsburgh Pirates. John McGraw hated the American League, always refused to play their champion those first 2 years. So that's why you get the first World Series, 1903. The Giants won the pennant the other 2 years. And we'll look at Ed Delahanty now. He's a star of the late 1800s. He plays baseball like a lot of the other guys we've looked at so far, this older style of baseball. Primarily with the Phillies. And the game's starting to pass him by, this new modern era that's pioneered by those Baltimore Orioles. And he's getting older in general. From what we can understand, he also enjoyed having a bit to drink. He was traded from his beloved Phillies while playing in Detroit to the Washington Nationals, who are a much worse team. He also had spent his whole life pretty much in Philly. And he gets blind drunk on the train back, eventually gets kicked out in Canada by Niagara Falls, pictured here. On July 3rd, 1903, Delahanty's body was found in the Niagara River. He had mysteriously fallen into the river. It's unknown how he died exactly, if he was drunk and fell off the bridge over the river, if he attempted suicide, or if he got in a fight and was pushed over. It is unknown. But with him, we kind of see in the canal corridor both the death of this era when baseball was great in upstate New York, and kind of the end. It's a very visceral end. And that used to be a horribly depressing way I would end this talk. And I could never figure out how to get around that. But then, luckily is not the right word, but in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic happened. Movement between Canada and the United States was greatly restricted. As a result, Canada's one Major League Baseball team, the Toronto Blue Jays, could not play in Canada. So they would play one whole season in 2020 in Buffalo, just a few blocks off of Canal Side in the Buffalo Bison's park. So for 1 year, Major League Baseball is back here in upstate New York. A few more stars of the game would come out of upstate New York in the Canal Corridor. In that era, after 1900, Warren Spahn is the most famous example. He's from Buffalo. But really, there's not tons to talk about there. But yeah, baseball was back, albeit briefly, in the Canal Corridor. And now, yeah, I'm done. They went back to Toronto, sadly. But they should have officially rebranded to this, I think, in 2020. But they didn't. Are there any questions?
What was the black player's last name?
Walker?
Fleetwood Walker?
Yes.
Okay.
Cool guy. Yes.
You showed various canal systems across the United States and the proliferation of baseball teams that arose along these canals. I imagine the canals brought along both prosperity and population, and you probably needed some degree of population for these teams, is that right?
Yes. To make them, that's kind of why those early leagues fail. They're just letting anyone in. You need a big enough population to support a professional team.
The one that you mentioned, deaf players had signs that would be maybe offered by their coach or their ref or the
Well, the catcher a lot of the time, yeah.
as to how the play should go. And what about the other things like chewing tobacco and drinking? I guess you said a lot of whiskey was wrong. So apparently they didn't have a lot of restrictions on their outside activities. But, these guys pretty rough and tough. The tobacco part of it probably.
No, tobacco certainly was, but that was just a ubiquitous part of like American life. Like everyone pretty much chewed tobacco. Alcohol was actually really controversial in baseball. Certain leagues would ban selling of it at the stadiums. I believe the National League did not allow alcohol to be served on Sundays. We talked about King Kelly, right? He's drinking all that whiskey, but he's told specifically he is not supposed to be. Like, his manager does not want him to. There's definitely a stereotype at the time of baseball players as these rough and tumble guys, though, which is why Joe Horning was really interesting, becoming like an early electrician. These guys are kind of thought of as dumb jocks, kind of. Here he is.
Blue collar.
Sure. There's a better way to say it, but there's kind of a stigma about these baseball players, and here he is, like finding this new technology and like innovating.
Well, Babe Ruth, I think, also had habits of,
Yes.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. Yes.
so maybe it's part of the nature of the sport. I don't know.
Yeah. There are a
Maybe not today.
lot of hard drinkers. One of my favorite ones is Paul Wayner of the Pittsburgh Pirates in 20s and 30s, I believe. He heavy drinker. He claimed he gave up drinking for one season and had his worst batting average. Anywho, any other questions? Well, great. If you want to learn more about drinking in the canal, I did write a book on the history of food in the Erie Canal. I have a few copies available, food and drink, available for $10. So, if you're interested.
I didn't know that Utica had a lot of German immigrants.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe Utica Club beer
Yeah.
had something to do with it.
Yes.
But I thought that they were more other parts of Europe.
A lot of Italians will eventually move to Utica as well.
Ukrainians, there's
Yep.
a whole population of.
Yeah, now, there's different
Yeah.
waves of immigration. Now you'll find a lot of people from the former Yugoslavia. A lot of Bosnians live in Utica as well. I gave a talk in Utica a couple months ago. First time I ever had Bosnian food. Pretty good. Highly recommend it if you can get a chance. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Derrick, for that great presentation. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Just a quick PSA. Tomorrow night's a big night here at the museum. It's our opening for our newest exhibit, Holy Matrimony and Heavenly Traditions. We have about a dozen wedding dresses from local residents on display with all the history of some of our wedding traditions. Tyler's been working hard at that for a month, so if you can come tomorrow night from 6 to 8 and check it out, please do. And we've also got our next Java with Joe next Thursday, the 23rd at 9 o'clock in the morning. Michael Eula, our county historian, will be in talking about his new book, Historical Chronicles of Genesee County. And playing off the Erie Canal theme, on June 12th, we will be having Dave Whitcomb, who's a member here in resident Batavia. He will be talking about the building of the Seneca Chief boat that just got launched, because he helped to build it. So he'll be talking about that process and the history of the boat. So please do come and check that out, and all sorts of other things going on here. So just keep an eye on your email if you're a member. If you're not a member, if you become a member, you'll get my emails. But also the website, Facebook, newspaper, penny saver, smoke signals, pigeons, who knows, I'll send it out to you. So, well, have a good night, everyone, and thank you for coming.